Book 1, Chapters 9 and 10 of The Blue Lagoon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. The Blue Lagoon by Vere Stacpoole. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Moonlight. "Daddy's a long time coming," said Dick all of a sudden. They were seated on the balks of timber that cumbered the deck of the brig on either side of the caboose, an ideal perch. The sun was setting over Australia way in a sea that seemed like a sea of boiling gold. Some mystery of mirage caused the water to heave and tremble as if troubled by fervent heat. "Aye, he is," said Mr Button. "But it's better late than never. No, don't be thinking of him, for that won't bring him. Look at the sun going into the water, and don't be speaking a word now, but listen, and you'll hear it hiss." The children gazed and listened, Paddy also. All three were mute as the great blazing shield touched the water that leapt to meet it. You could hear the water hiss, if you had imagination enough. Once having touched the water, the sun went down behind it as swiftly as a man in a hurry going down a ladder. As he vanished, a ghostly and golden twilight spread over the sea, a light exquisite but immensely forlorn. When the sea became a violet shadow, the west darkened as if to a closing door, and the stars rushed over the sky. "Mr Button," said Emmeline, nodding towards the sun as he vanished, "what's over there?" "The west," replied he, staring at the sunset. "Chiny and Ingy and all the way beyond." "Where's the sun gone to now, Paddy?" asked Dick. "He's gone chasing the moon, and she's skedaddling with her dress brailed up for all she's worth. She'll be along up in a minute. He's always after her, but he's never caught her yet." "What would he do to her if he caught her?" asked Emmeline. "Faith, and maybe he'd fetch her a scalp, and well she'd deserve it." "Why'd she deserve it?" asked Dick, who was in one of his questioning moods. "Because she's always deluthering people and leading them astray. Girls or men, she'll moither them till once she gets the comither on them, same as she did Buck McCann." "Who's he?" "Buck McCann? Faith, he was the village idiot where I used to live in the old days." "How's that?" "Hold your wisht, and don't be asking questions. He was always wanting the moon, though he was 20 and 6 feet 4. He'd a gob on him that hung open like a rat trap with a broken spring, and he was as thin as a barber's pole. You could have tied a reef knot in the middle of him, and when the moon was full, there was no holding him." Mr Button gazed at the reflection of the sunset on the water for a moment, as if recalling some from the past, and then proceeded. "He'd sit in the grass staring at her, and then he'd start to chase her over the hills, and they'd find him at last, maybe a day or two later, lost in the mountains, grazing on berries, and green as a cabbage from the hunger and the cold, till it got so bad at long last they had to hobble him." "I've seen a donkey hobbled," cried Dick. "Then you've seen the twin brother of Buck McCann. Well, one night me elder brother Tim was sitting over the fire, smoking his dundeen and thinking of his sins, when in comes Buck with the hobbles on him. 'Tim,' says he, 'I've got her at last.' 'Got who?' says Tim. 'The moon,' says he. 'Got her where?' says Tim. 'In a bucket by the pond,' says t'other. 'Safe and sound, and not a scratch on her. You come and look,' says he. So Tim follows him. he hobbling, and they go to the pond side, and there, sure enough, stood a tin bucket full of water, and on the water the reflection of the moon. "I dridged her out of the pond," whispers Buck. "Easy now," says he, "and I'll dribble the water out gently," says he, "and we'll catch her alive at the bottom of it, like a trout." So he drains the water out gently of the bucket, till it was near all gone, and then he looks in the bucket expecting to find the moon floundering at the bottom of it like a flat fish. "She's gone, bad cess to her," says he. "Try again," says me brother, and Buck fills the bucket again, and there was the moon sure enough when the water came to stand still. "Go on," says me brother, "drain out the water, but go gentle, or she'll give yez the slip again." "1 minute," says Buck. "I've got an idea," says he. "She won't give me the slip this time," says he. "You wait for me," says he, and off he hobbles to his old mother's cabin, a stone's throw away, and back he comes with a sieve. "You hold the sieve," says Buck, "and I'll drain the water into it. If she escapes from the bucket, we'll have her in the sieve." And he pours the water out of the bucket as gentle as if it were cream out of a jug. When all the water was out, he turns the bucket bottom up and shook it. "Ran dan the thing," he cries. "She's gone again." And with that he flings the bucket into the pond and the sieve after the bucket, when up comes his own mother hobbling on her stick. "Where's me bucket?" says she. "In the pond," says Buck. "And me sieve?" says she. "Gone after the bucket." "I'll give yez a bucketing," says she, and she up with the stick and landed him a skelp and driv him roaring and hobbling before her, and locked him up in the cabin, and kept him on bread and water for a week to get the moon out of his head. But she might have saved the trouble, for that day month it was again, "There she comes." The moon, argent and splendid, was breaking from the water. She was full, and her light was powerful almost as the light of day. The shadows of the children and the queer shadow of Mr Button were cast on the wall of the caboose, hard and black as silhouettes. "Look at our shadows," cried Dick, taking off his broad-brimmed straw hat and waving it. Emmeline held up her doll to see its shadow, and Mr Button held up his pipe. "Come now," said he, putting the pipe back in his mouth and making to rise, "and shunder off to bed. 'Tis time you were asleep, the both of you." Dick began to yowl. "I don't want to go to bed. I ain't tired, Paddy. Let's stay a little longer." "Not a minute," said the other with all the decision of a nurse. "Not a minute after me pipe's out." "Fill it again," said Dick. Mr Button made no reply. The pipe gurgled as he puffed at it, a kind of death rattle speaking of almost immediate extinction. "Mr Button," said Emmeline. She was holding her nose in the air and sniffing. Seated to windward of the smoker and out of the pig-tailed poisoned air, her delicate sense of smell perceived something lost to the others. "What is it, acushla?" "I smell something." "What do you say you smell?" "Something nice." "What's it like?" asked Dick, sniffing hard. "I don't smell anything." Emmeline sniffed again to make sure. "Flowers," said she. The breeze, which had shifted several points since midday, was bearing with it a faint, faint odour, a perfume of vanilla and spice, so faint as to be imperceptible to all but the most acute olfactory sense. "Flowers," said the old sailor, tapping the ashes cut of his pipe against the heel of his boot. "And where'd you get flowers in the middle of the say? It's dreaming ye are. Come now, to bed wid yez." "Fill it again," wailed Dick, referring to the pipe. "It's a spanking I'll give you," replied his guardian, lifting him down from the timber balks and then assisting Emmeline. "In 2 ticks if you don't behave. Come along, Emmeline." He started aft, a small hand in each of his, Dick bellowing. As they passed the ship's bell, Dick stretched towards the belaying pin that was still lying in the deck, seized it, and hit the bell a mighty bang. It was the last pleasure to be snatched before sleep, and he snatched it. Paddy had made up beds for himself and his charges in the deck-house. He had cleared the stuff off the table, broke open the windows to get the musty smell away, and placed the mattresses from the captain and mate's cabins on the floor. When the children were in bed and asleep, he went to the starboard rail and, leaning on it, looked over the moonlit sea. He was thinking of ships as his wandering eye roved over the sea spaces, little dreaming of the message that the perfumed breeze was bearing him, the message that had been received and dimly understood by Emmeline. Then he leaned with his back to the rail and his hands in his pockets. He was not thinking now. He was ruminating. The basis of the Irish character as exemplified by Paddy Button is a profound laziness mixed with a profound melancholy. Yet Paddy, in his left-handed way, was as hard a worker as any man on board ship, and as for melancholy, he was the life and soul of the forecastle. Yet there they were, the laziness and the melancholy, only waiting to be tapped. As he stood with his hands thrust deep in his pockets, longshore fashion, counting the dowels in the planking of the deck by the moonlight, he was reviewing the old days. The tale of Buck McCann had recalled them, and across all the salt seas he could see the moonlight on the Connemara mountains, and hear the seagulls crying on the thunderous beach, where each wave has behind it 3,000 miles of sea. Suddenly Mr Button came back from the mountains of Connemara to find himself on the deck of the Shenandoah, and he instantly became possessed by fears. Beyond the white deserted deck, barred by the shadows of the standing rigging, he could see the door of the caboose. Suppose he should suddenly see a head pop out, or worse, a shadowy form go in. He turned to the deck-house where the children were sound asleep, and where, in a few minutes, he too was sound asleep beside them, whilst all night long the brig rocked to the gentle swell of the Pacific, and the breeze blew, bringing with it the perfume of flowers. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Tragedy of the Boats. When the fog lifted after midnight, the people in the longboat saw the quarter-boat half a mile to starboard of them. "Can you see the dinghy?" asked Lestrange of the captain, who was standing up, searching the horizon. "Not a speck," answered Lafarge. "Damn that Irishman! But for him I'd have got the boats away properly victualled and all. As it is, I dunno what we've got aboard. You, Jenkins, what have you got for'ard there?" "2 bags of bread and a beaker of water," answered the steward. "A beaker of water be sugared," came another voice. "A beaker half full, you mean." Then the steward's voice. "So it is. There's not more than a couple of gallons in her." "My God," said Lafarge. "Damn that Irishman." "There's not more than'll give us 2 half pannikins apiece all round," said the steward. "Maybe," said Lafarge. "The quarter-boat's better stocked. Pull for her." "She's pulling for us," said the stroke oar. "Captain," asked Lestrange, "are you sure there's no sight of the dinghy?" "None," replied Lafarge. The unfortunate man's head sank on his breast. He had little time to brood over his troubles, however, for a tragedy was beginning to unfold around him, the most shocking perhaps in the annals of the sea, a tragedy to be hinted at rather than spoken of. When the boats were within hailing distance, a man in the bow of the longboat rose up. "Quarter boat ahoy!" "Ahoy!" "How much water have you?" "None." The word came floating over the placid moonlit water. At it the fellows in the longboat ceased rowing, and you could see the water drops dripping off their oars like diamonds in the moonlight. "Quarter boat ahoy!" shouted the fellow in the bow. "Lay on your oars." "Here, you, scowbanker," cried Lafarge. "Who are you to be giving orders?" "Scowbanker yourself," replied the fellow. "Bullies, put her about." The starboard oars backed water, and the boat came round. By chance the worst lot of the Northumberland's crew were in the longboat, veritable scowbankers, scum, and how scum clings to life you will never know until you have been amongst it in an open boat at sea. Lafarge had no more command over this lot than you have who are reading this book. "Heave to!" came from the quarter boat as she laboured behind. "Lay on your oars, bullies!" cried the ruffian at the bow, who was still standing up like an evil genius who had taken momentary command over events. "Lay on your oars, bullies! They'd better have it now." The quarter boat in her turn ceased rowing, and lay a cable's length away. "How much water have you?" came the mate's voice. "Not enough to go round." Lafarge made to rise, and the stroke oar struck at him, catching him in the wind and doubling him up in the bottom of the boat. "Give us some, for God's sake," came the mate's voice. "We're parched with rowing, and there's a woman on board." The fellow in the bow of the longboat, as if someone had suddenly struck him, broke into a tornado of blasphemy. "Give us some," came the mate's voice, "or by God we'll lay you aboard." Before the words were well spoken, the men in the quarter boat carried the threat into action. The conflict was brief. The quarter boat was too crowded for fighting. The starboard men in the longboat fought with their oars, whilst the fellows to port steadied the boat. The fight did not last long, and presently the quarter boat sheered off, half of the men in her cut about the head and bleeding, 2 of them senseless. It was sundown on the following day. The longboat lay adrift. The last drop of water had been served out 8 hours before. The quarter boat, like a horrible phantom, had been haunting and pursuing her all day, begging for water when there was none. It was like the prayers one might expect to hear in hell. The men in the longboat, gloomy and morose, weighed down with a sense of crime, tortured by thirst, and tormented by the voices imploring for water, lay on their oars when the other boat tried to approach. Now and then, suddenly, and as if moved by a common impulse, they would all shout out together, "We have none!" But the quarter boat would not believe. It was in vain to hold the beaker with the bung out to prove the dryness. The half-delirious creatures had it fixed in their minds that their comrades were withholding from them the water that was not. Just as the sun touched the sea, Lestrange, rousing himself from a torpor into which he had sunk, raised himself and looked over the gunwale. He saw the quarter boat drifting a cable's length away, lit by the full light of sunset, and the spectres in it, seeing him, held out in mute appeal their blackened tongues. Of the night that followed it is almost impossible to speak. thirst was nothing to what the scowbankers suffered from the torture of the whimpering appeal for water that came to them at intervals during the night. When at last the Arago, a French whale ship, sighted them, the crew of the longboat were still alive, but 3 of them were raving madmen. Of the crew of the quarter-boat was saved not one. End of chapter 10 and end of part 1 of The Blue Lagoon.